The grocery store checkout line moved slowly on that Tuesday afternoon. Sarah Martinez, dressed in her simple work uniform, smiled politely as she scanned items: milk, bread, cereal. Just another ordinary day at her part-time job. The elderly veteran in front of her fumbled with his wallet, and as he reached for his credit card, a small metallic object tumbled from Sarah's shirt pocket, clattering onto the conveyor belt. The man's eyes widened as he stared at the distinctive wings, black and gold, unmistakable to anyone who knew military aviation. "Those are Black Hawk pilot wings," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Sarah's cheeks flushed as she quickly retrieved them, but it was too late. The secret she'd kept hidden for months was out. What this grocery store clerk had done in the skies over Afghanistan would soon change everything. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Martinez reached for another can of green beans, the familiar beep of the scanner marking another item in what felt like her 1,000th transaction of the day. At 28, she moved with a quiet efficiency that her coworkers admired. Her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her name tag slightly crooked on her blue vest. To everyone at Miller's Grocery, she was just Sarah, reliable, hardworking, always willing to stay late when someone called in sick. Nobody asked about her past, and that's exactly how she preferred it. "Paper or plastic?" she asked the woman in front of her, the same question she'd asked hundreds of times before. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Scan, bag, smile, repeat. No split-second decisions that could mean life or death. No radio chatter filled with coordinates and enemy positions. Just the simple rhythm of everyday life that most people took for granted, but Sarah treasured like a precious gift. She'd learned to find peace in the ordinary, in the safety of routine tasks that demanded nothing more than showing up and doing her job well. The afternoon crowd was typical for a Tuesday. Elderly customers moving slowly through the aisles, young mothers juggling toddlers and shopping lists, a few teenagers grabbing snacks after school. Sarah knew many of them by name now, had heard their stories during countless brief conversations over the checkout counter. Mrs. Henderson always bought the same brand of tea and told stories about her grandchildren. Mike, the construction worker, came in every day at 3:30 for an energy drink and a bag of chips. These small interactions had become the threads that wove her new life together, each one a reminder that she was building something different now, something quiet and stable. As she worked, Sarah was careful about her movements, mindful of the small weight in her shirt pocket that she kept pressed close to her chest. The wings were always there, a reminder of who she used to be, but she'd grown skilled at keeping them hidden. She'd developed habits, checking her pocket when she bent over, adjusting her vest when she reached for high shelves, always conscious of maintaining the careful boundary between her past and present. Her co-workers saw her as reserved but friendly, professional but warm. They had no idea that the woman bagging their groceries had once piloted a $64 million aircraft through some of the most dangerous airspace in the world. The elderly man approached her checkout line just before 4 o'clock, moving slowly but with purpose. He wore a Vietnam veteran's cap and a jacket covered in military patches, his weathered hands gripping a small basket containing a few basic items. Sarah smiled at him, the same way she smiled at all her customers, but something in his eyes, a recognition she'd seen in other veterans, made her slightly more cautious. He had that look, the one that said he'd seen things, done things, carried weight that civilian life couldn't quite shake off. As she began scanning his items, she noticed the way he studied her face, as if trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "Thank you for your service," she said quietly as she noticed his Purple Heart pin, the words coming naturally. She always acknowledged the veterans who came through her line, understanding the importance of recognition even in small moments. The man nodded, his eyes still studying her with that curious intensity. He fumbled with his wallet as she finished bagging his items, and as he reached for his credit card, disaster struck. Sarah bent slightly to help him with a dropped receipt, and the movement caused her shirt pocket to gape open just enough. The black and gold wings tumbled out, catching the fluorescent light as they clattered onto the conveyor belt between a box of crackers and a jar of peanut butter. Time seemed to freeze as both Sarah and the veteran stared at the distinctive wings. She felt her heart stop, her carefully constructed world suddenly tilting on its axis. The man's eyes widened and she watched recognition dawn across his weathered features like sunrise breaking over a mountain range. "Those are Black Hawk pilot wings," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. His hands trembled slightly as he pointed at the small piece of metal that represented years of training, months of combat missions and experiences that had shaped her into someone she was still learning to understand. Sarah's cheeks burned as she quickly snatched up the wings, but she knew it was too late. The secret she'd guarded so carefully, the identity she'd worked so hard to keep separate from her new life, was now exposed under the harsh grocery store lights. Everything was about to change. The veteran's question hung in the air like smoke from a flare gun. "Ma'am, were you really a Black Hawk pilot?" His voice carried the kind of respect reserved for fellow warriors, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of her past pressing against her chest. She glanced around the store, grateful that her line had emptied and her supervisor was nowhere in sight. With trembling hands, she tucked the wings back into her pocket, but the damage was done. The wall she'd built between her military service and civilian life had crumbled in an instant, and there was no rebuilding it now. "Yes," she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of everything she'd experienced and everything she'd tried to leave behind. The admission felt like opening a door she'd kept locked for months, and suddenly the memories came rushing back with startling clarity. She could almost hear the rhythmic thrum of rotor blades cutting through desert air, feel the vibration of the aircraft beneath her hands, taste the metallic tang of adrenaline that had once been as familiar as her morning coffee. The grocery store around her seemed to fade as her mind transported her back to Forward Operating Base Chapman, where she'd spent 14 months living in a world where every sunrise might be her last. The training had been brutal. Hundreds of hours learning to master an aircraft that demanded absolute precision and unwavering focus. Sarah remembered her first solo flight in the Black Hawk, the moment when she realized she was actually piloting one of the most sophisticated helicopters in military history. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Weather conditions, enemy threats, mechanical failures, navigation challenges. Every scenario had been drilled into her until her responses became instinctive. She'd studied aerodynamics until she could calculate lift ratios in her sleep, memorized emergency procedures until they became second nature, and pushed her physical and mental limits until she discovered reserves of strength she never knew existed. But nothing in training had truly prepared her for the reality of combat operations. The first time she'd taken fire, Sarah had felt the aircraft shudder as bullets struck the fuselage, and she'd realized that all her technical knowledge meant nothing if she couldn't keep her nerve under pressure. The missions came in waves: medical evacuations from remote outposts, supply runs to isolated forward bases, reconnaissance flights over hostile territory, and transport missions that required threading through mountain passes while avoiding enemy radar. Each flight demanded split-second decisions that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure, between bringing everyone home and leaving families to grieve. The weight of responsibility had been crushing at times. Sarah carried not just her own life in her hands every time she lifted off, but the lives of her crew and anyone they were tasked to transport or rescue. She remembered the faces of wounded soldiers she'd evacuated, their trust in her abilities absolute even as they fought to stay conscious. She recalled the relief in the voices of ground units when her aircraft appeared on the horizon, knowing that extraction or supplies were finally within reach. Every successful mission had felt like a small victory against chaos, every safe landing a testament to her training and determination. The aircraft itself had become an extension of her body and mind. She knew every gauge, every control, every subtle vibration that indicated normal operation or potential trouble. The Black Hawk was powerful and reliable, but it demanded respect and constant attention. Sarah had learned to read the sky like a book, understanding wind patterns and weather systems with an intuitive knowledge that came from hundreds of hours in the cockpit. She could land in conditions that would challenge even experienced pilots, navigate by instruments through sandstorms that reduced visibility to zero, and maintain aircraft control in situations that pushed both machine and pilot to their absolute limits. As she stood in the grocery store, the veteran still waiting patiently for her response. Sarah realized that part of her missed the intensity and purpose of those days. Despite the danger and stress, there had been something pure about military service, a clear mission, defined objectives, and the knowledge that every action served a greater purpose. The transition to civilian life had been jarring, like stepping from a world of vivid colors into one painted in shades of gray. Nothing in her current life demanded the same level of skill, dedication, and courage that had once defined her daily existence. Sometimes she wondered if she'd ever again experience the profound sense of purpose that had sustained her through the most challenging period of her life. The veteran leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper filled with understanding. "I can see it in your eyes," he said gently. "You've been carrying something heavy, haven't you?" Sarah's composure finally cracked, and she found herself nodding as tears she'd held back for months threatened to spill over. The mission that haunted her dreams, the one that had earned her a commendation she'd never felt worthy of receiving, suddenly felt like a story that needed telling. Maybe it was time to let someone else carry part of the weight she'd been bearing alone. It had been a routine supply run that turned into something far more dangerous. October 15th, 2022. A date burned into her memory like a brand. Sarah and her crew had been tasked with delivering medical supplies to a remote outpost that had been cut off by enemy activity for 3 days. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with sandstorms reducing visibility and creating dangerous flying conditions, but the soldiers at the outpost were critically low on antibiotics and blood products. Command had made the decision to risk the mission because waiting wasn't an option. Lives hung in the balance. The flight to the outpost had been challenging but manageable. Sarah had navigated through the storm using instruments and her co-pilot's guidance, threading between mountain peaks while monitoring radio chatter that painted an increasingly grim picture of the tactical situation on the ground. When they finally reached the landing zone, it was immediately clear that something had gone wrong. The outpost was under active attack, with tracer rounds lighting up the darkening sky like deadly fireworks. Ground control was requesting immediate evacuation of wounded personnel, but landing in a hot zone during a firefight violated every safety protocol in the book. Sarah had circled the area twice, assessing the situation and calculating risks, while her crew prepared for what they all knew would be the most dangerous landing of their careers. The small landing zone was partially obscured by smoke from burning structures, and enemy positions in the surrounding hills had clear sight lines to where she would need to set down. Radio communication with the ground was sporadic due to the storm, making coordination even more challenging. Every instinct told her to abort the mission and return to base, but she could hear the desperation in the ground commander's voice as he reported multiple casualties who would die without immediate medical evacuation. The decision to land changed everything. As Sarah brought the Black Hawk down through intense ground fire, she felt the aircraft take multiple hits, including one that shattered part of her windscreen and sent fragments of metal and glass through the cockpit. Her crew chief was wounded in the initial approach, but continued directing the loading of casualties while blood ran down his arm. In less than 4 minutes, they managed to load 8 wounded soldiers, including 2 who were barely clinging to life. The takeoff was even more harrowing than the landing. The aircraft was overweight and struggling to gain altitude while enemy fire continued to track their movement through the sky. What should have been a victory became a nightmare during the flight back to base. One of the wounded soldiers, barely 18 years old, began hemorrhaging despite the medics' efforts to stabilize him. Sarah could hear the frantic medical work happening behind her as she fought to keep the damaged aircraft airborne, while racing against time and weather to reach the field hospital. The young soldier's vital signs were failing, and everyone on board knew that every second counted. She pushed the Black Hawk beyond its recommended limits, flying through conditions that should have grounded all aircraft, driven by the knowledge that a mother somewhere would either welcome her son home or receive a flag instead. They made it to the hospital with less than 2 minutes to spare. The wounded soldiers were rushed into surgery, and Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that everyone would survive. But 3 hours later, she received word that the young soldier had died on the operating table despite the medical team's best efforts. The official report called the mission a success: 7 lives saved, critical supplies delivered, aircraft recovered despite significant damage, Sarah received a Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow failed the one soldier who didn't make it home. The guilt and second-guessing had followed her back to civilian life like a shadow. She replayed that mission endlessly, wondering if she could have flown faster, landed more smoothly, or made different decisions that might have changed the outcome. The rational part of her mind understood that she had performed exceptionally under impossible conditions, that the soldier's wounds were simply too severe for any medical intervention to be successful. But the emotional weight of carrying someone's final moments, of being the last hope for a family she would never meet, had fundamentally changed how she saw herself and her place in the world. The veteran reached across the checkout counter and gently placed his weathered hand over Sarah's trembling fingers. "You brought 7 soldiers home that day," he said with quiet certainty, as if he somehow knew the details of her story without being told. "That young man who didn't make it, he died knowing someone cared enough to risk everything for him. That matters more than you realize." His words carried the weight of experience, the understanding that only comes from someone who has faced similar impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Word of Sarah's military service spread through the small community faster than she had ever imagined possible. The veteran, whose name was Frank Morrison, had served 3 tours in Vietnam and understood the importance of recognizing service members who preferred to remain in the shadows. He didn't gossip or sensationalize her story, but he made sure the right people knew that the quiet grocery store clerk was actually a decorated combat veteran who deserved their respect and gratitude. Within days, Sarah noticed subtle changes in how customers interacted with her. Longer conversations, more genuine smiles, and an undercurrent of admiration that made her uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. The local newspaper editor, a former Army journalist named Patricia Wells, approached Sarah during her lunch break 3 days after the incident with her wings. Patricia had heard about Sarah's service through Frank and wanted to share her story with the broader community, but she approached the request with sensitivity and respect for Sarah's privacy. They sat in the small break room behind the store, surrounded by employee schedules and safety notices, as Patricia explained how important it was for people to understand that heroes often hide in plain sight, working ordinary jobs while carrying extraordinary experiences. Initially, Sarah resisted the idea of publicity. She had worked so hard to build a quiet life, to find peace in anonymity and routine. The thought of having her story plastered across the local news filled her with anxiety and dread. But Patricia helped her understand that sharing her experience could serve a greater purpose, inspiring other veterans to seek help when they needed it, educating civilians about the challenges faced by returning service members, and honoring the memory of those who didn't make it home. After several conversations and careful consideration, Sarah agreed to a small feature story that would focus on the broader themes of service and sacrifice, rather than sensationalizing her individual heroism. The response to the newspaper article exceeded everyone's expectations. Letters and emails poured in from across the region, from fellow veterans who understood her struggle, from military families who wanted to thank her for her service, and from civilians who had never truly grasped the daily reality of military life. A local veterans organization reached out to invite her to speak at their monthly meeting, not as a celebrity or hero, but as someone who could help bridge the gap between military and civilian communities. Sarah was surprised to discover that talking about her experiences, rather than hiding from them, actually began to lighten the emotional burden she had been carrying. The most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after her story appeared in the newspaper, Sarah received a phone call from Lisa Martinez, no relation, despite sharing a last name, whose son had been one of the soldiers Sarah had rescued during that fateful mission in Afghanistan. Lisa had tracked down Sarah's story through military channels and wanted to express her gratitude in person. They met at a small cafe near the grocery store, and Lisa brought photo albums filled with images of her son's wedding, his graduation from college, and his first child, a daughter born 6 months after his return from deployment. "He talks about you sometimes," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion as she showed Sarah pictures of her grandson taking his first steps. "He says you saved his life, but more than that, you gave him back his future. This little boy exists because you were brave enough to land that helicopter when everyone else would have turned around." Sarah stared at the photographs, seeing for the first time the ripple effects of her actions, the lives that had continued and flourished because of decisions made in a few desperate minutes under enemy fire. The weight she had been carrying didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed into something more manageable, a responsibility to honor the trust placed in her, rather than a burden of guilt and regret. As autumn turned to winter, Sarah found herself settling into a new rhythm that incorporated both her military identity and her civilian life. She continued working at the grocery store, but she also began volunteering with local veterans organizations, helping newly discharged service members navigate the challenges of returning to civilian life. She spoke occasionally at high schools about military service, not to recruit or glorify war, but to help young people understand the complexity and cost of the freedoms they enjoyed. The wings that had once felt like a secret shame now rested proudly on her dresser at home, a reminder of who she had been and who she continued to be. The grocery store customers who had known her as simply Sarah now understood that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. But rather than treating her differently, they seemed to appreciate more deeply the quiet dignity with which she approached her work. She was still the same person who stayed late when colleagues needed help, who remembered their preferences and asked about their families, who brought patience and kindness to every interaction. The difference was that now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had accepted all parts of her story, the triumphs and tragedies, the moments of courage and the periods of doubt, the recognition and the anonymity that had followed. Sarah Martinez's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often hidden behind ordinary jobs and quiet lives. The courage required to risk everything for others doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off. It transforms into different kinds of bravery. The bravery to start over, to build new meaning from difficult experiences, to carry the weight of service with dignity while forging a path forward in civilian life. Her journey from the cockpit of a Black Hawk helicopter to the checkout counter of a grocery store illustrates the complex transition that thousands of veterans navigate every day. Some struggle in silence, carrying invisible wounds and memories that civilian life cannot easily accommodate. Others, like Sarah, eventually find ways to integrate their military experience with their new identity, discovering that their service continues to define them not as a limitation, but as a source of strength and purpose. The recognition Sarah finally received wasn't about celebrity or fame. It was about acknowledgement, understanding, and the simple but profound act of saying thank you to someone who had given everything in service to others. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer our veterans is not pity or charity, but respect for their sacrifice and recognition of the ongoing value they bring to their communities. As we go about our daily lives, interacting with the people who serve us in restaurants, stores, hospitals, and countless other places, we might pause to remember that some of them carry stories of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. The person bagging your groceries might once have saved lives under enemy fire. The server bringing your coffee might be a decorated veteran still learning to find purpose in civilian life. The mechanic fixing your car might have once maintained aircraft in combat zones where every repair could mean the difference between life and death. These heroes don't seek recognition or special treatment. They simply want the opportunity to contribute, to build meaningful lives, and to be valued for who they are now as well as who they once were. Sarah's story teaches us that service doesn't end with discharge, that heroism takes many forms, and that the quiet dignity of everyday work can be just as honorable as the most dramatic military mission. If this story of hidden courage and quiet heroism resonated with you, please consider subscribing to hear more stories of the extraordinary people who shape our communities in ways both seen and unseen. Share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that their service matters, that their sacrifice is remembered, and that heroes truly do walk among us every single day. Together we can ensure that no veteran's story goes untold, and no service member's contribution goes unrecognized.